How to make a fur shawl one day before a wedding with a pull-through. I bought 2 yards of fur fabric and 2 yards of a matching satin lining, but you might need more or less depending on the size you're making and your design. I marked how wide I wanted my shawl to be, including seam allowance, so it was 14 inches and 2 yards long, and then I cut the fur fabric from the back side to avoid cutting through the fur. For the lining, instead of cutting out the same size measurements as the fur, I cut it an inch wider, so 15 inches, just in case it gets tricky to sew and moves around a lot. Once the lining and fur are cut, I can sew them right sides together. Here are some of my do's and don'ts for sewing a fur shawl. Don't waste time pinning the lining and fur together like how I'm doing here. I'll explain why later. Do use a sewing machine to sew a strong seam. Do use a walking foot to move the thick layers through your sewing machine. And do use a bigger size needle and longer stitch length. Don't sew with the fur layer on top because the satin layer will end up being shorter, and even if you pinned it like me, the fabric will move around, which is why I think it's a waste of time to pin it. Do seam rip and try again if you mess up. This time I didn't pin the fabric together at all and just held the lining layer on top. Lined up the edges of the fabric, and now it's sewing evenly. When you get to the end, pivot and turn. I had extra lining fabric hanging out, but I just felt for the fur edge underneath and sewed straight across. You can see here I don't have any pins in my fabric, which allows me to readjust and smooth out my lining to make sure it's laying flat and not rippled. When you get to the end, leave the short side open so you can turn the shawl right sides out. If your fur is super bulky, you can trim it down in the seam allowance. Highly recommend keeping a vacuum nearby for a quick cleanup. Next, turn the shawl right sides out through the open side and poke out all the corners. To close up the opening, fold the raw edges inside and use clips or pins to hold it in place while you hand sew it closed with a blind stitch. You can stop here or create an opening to pull your shawl through. I honestly didn't know the best way to do this, so what made the most sense to me was sewing a giant buttonhole. First, mark how big your buttonhole will be. Mine was 4 inches, but you might want to make it smaller or bigger depending on how thick your fabric is. I marked a rectangle box 1/4 inch around the line and sewed the rectangle down on my sewing machine. Next, in the very middle of the box, make a small snip through both layers of the shawl and cut a straight line up to the stitching, but not through it. Since I can't sew a big buttonhole on my sewing machine, I hand sewed one using a blanket stitch. The rectangle I sewed will stabilize and hold the layers together and also act as a guideline for my blanket stitch. This is my first time hand sewing a buttonhole, but I realized that I should have made the stitches closer together for a stronger and prettier look. Here is the final look. You can't even see the stitching from the outside at all since the fur covers it, and here it is in action. So fancy and elegant.